Well, hello, Biblical Theological Seminary alumni. I am Dr. Cyndi Parker, and I just wanted to come and give you a quick overview of this really great seminar that we had on May 19th. So we put together a seminar. It was BTS who partnered with InterServe, and we did a seminar that was called God's Radical Hospitality. So engaging the Christian perspective on Muslim immigration and our Muslim neighbors. One of the things that came out of that seminar, however, was a focus more on God's character than on a Christian response to Muslim immigration. So the fact that we are actually after God's heart. What does God say that people who are following him, how they should treat the foreigners among them? So I am going to give you a little bit out of Deuteronomy. And I know at this point, some of you are tilting your head to the side or lifting your eyebrows or furrowing your eyebrows. Deuteronomy never sounds very interesting. It's one of the versions of the law code that we find in the Pentateuch. But Deuteronomy is one of my favorite books, and I think is one of the books that displays what God's love for his people is like. So we are going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 10. So before we even get there, let me just set the stage for you. As you may know, Deuteronomy is written so that it sets Moses on the shores of the Jordan River talking to the Israelite people. One of the primary messages in Deuteronomy is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it's called the Shema. Because it begins with, "Hear, O Israel, Shema Israel." So hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And some of you, if you grew up in a Christian home, in the back of your head, you're going to hear that that sentence doesn't seem quite completed. Because in the New Testament, we have Jesus adding on, "and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Where do we get that little add-on? Because the first part is very clearly from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Well, Hebrew scholars have looked at Deuteronomy 6, and after the Shema, when it says, "and you will love the Lord your God." In the Hebrew, that is a very unique "and you will love." That command is really quite a unique command. It is only found 4 different times in the Bible, in the Old Testament. All 4 times are in the Pentateuch. We have twice in Deuteronomy where it is saying the exact same thing. "And you will love the Lord your God." The other 2 times are from Leviticus 19. So Leviticus 19:18 starts with, "Do not seek revenge or bear grudge against anyone among your people, but you will love the neighbor as yourself because I am the Lord." So we have this connection, and you will love your neighbor, your fellow countrymen. And why? Because I am the Lord your God. Interestingly, just a few verses later, in Leviticus 19:34, the subject is no longer your neighbor, your own countryman. It is the foreigner who is among you. And it says, "The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born, and you will love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt." And why? Because I am the Lord. So Deuteronomy 6, one of the primary key passages in Deuteronomy, the Shema, is connected with this idea of you will love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind. And in the Hebrew, that it connects to our Leviticus law code, which is saying, "and you will love your own countrymen." And why do you love them that way? Because God is who he says he is. And also you will love the foreigner who is among you. And why do you love the foreigner? Because you serve the God that you serve. Now let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 10. So this is a little bit of poetry. So again, sometimes I lose people when they hear poetry because they don't think poetry is all that interesting. However, Hebrew poetry can be really fantastic. So Hebrew poetry relies on repetition and symmetry. So it doesn't rely on the rhyming as we would do in English. So we're looking for repetitive ideas, and we're looking for symmetry. So we are going to find this in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 14 and on. So let me start. I'm actually going to start reading in verse 12, because verse 12 is a repetition of what we have already heard earlier in Deuteronomy 6. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? So basically, what is the summary of the law code? What is the thing that God cares most about? But to fear the Lord your God, walk in obedience to him, and to love him, to serve the Lord your God with your heart, with all your soul, and observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I'm giving you today. What we're going to have is a couple parallel thoughts. So we're going to have an A thought, a B thought, a C thought, and then it's going to start all over, and we'll get A prime, B prime, and C prime. Okay, so just stick with me for just a moment. So verse 14, we're working on the motivation, why we're doing these things. To the Lord your God belongs the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth and everything that is in it. This is our first thought. We're setting up the thought because God, to him belongs the heavens of the heavens, the highest of the heavens, and earth and everything on the earth. So we're starting with a super majestic, beautiful picture of who God is. Verse 15, this is our second thought. Yet the Lord set his affection on your ancestors and loved them, because he chose you, that your descendants, above all the nations as it is today. Right, so do you hear? Thought one, A. God is the God of the heavens and the earth and everything on the earth. And what did God do? He chose your ancestors and he chose you. So our third thought, C, is going to be your response. Verse 16, circumcise your hearts therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. So the idea of circumcising your heart, right, we're borrowing covenantal language, but basically it's saying that harder outer covering, that barrier that gets between your full embodied human heart, take that away in response to God. Right? So we have a three thought process in the first part of the poetry. God is the God of the heavens and the earth and everything on the earth. He chose your ancestors, and your response is to circumcise your hearts and to love God in return. Now the next verses are going to go back and repeat, and now we're going to get the symmetry and the parallelism. Verse 17, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. So do you hear it again? We're back to what God's character is. We're using different language, though, which is really quite interesting. So God of gods and Lord of lords. Now we're borrowing normal ancient Near Eastern language. So the ancient Near Eastern kings used to call themselves the Lord of lords. They are the most elevated of all of the elevated in society. Now, in the ancient Near East, this often meant that people who held those kind of titles also saw themselves to be above the law. They don't have to do anything they don't want to do. The law bends around them. We have here God being called the God of gods, the Lord of lords. That's our thought one. So what is he going to do with those kinds of titles? So now we read on in verse 18. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. So our God, who on the first thought the first part of the poetry was the God of the heavens and the earth and everything in it, is also the God who's the God of gods and the Lord of lords. These are the most elevated, majestic, and beautiful titles. And what does he do? Well, the first part of the poetry, he chose the ancestors. The second part of the poetry, he has cared for the foreigner who is among you and the orphan and the widow. So he goes out to the people on the perimeter of society who are not protected by the majority of laws and pulls them in and becomes their protection. So at this point, you should be anticipating what the third part of the poem is. What is your response? And so it says in verse 19, and you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. So what is your response? Your response is to be just like the God you serve and to go out and to take care of foreigners. And why? Because you yourself at one point in time were also a foreigner. Now, keeping in mind that the people who are currently being addressed in this were not they themselves the foreigner. They are second, third, fourth, fifth generation immigrants into that part of the country. However, they are supposed to have the long memory that tells them at some point in time, they were the one who was on the perimeter, or their parents were, or their grandparents were. And God stepped in, and although God was the most majestic of all majestic beings, he cares for their ancestors and the foreigners who are among them. And so they too hold the responsibility to go out and care for the foreigner among them. So we have this great piece of poetry in the book of Deuteronomy. So a book that is centered around how do you love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. We have it laid out for us here in Deuteronomy chapter 10. God, who is the most majestic of gods, has chosen your ancestors and has cared for the foreigner. So therefore, you need to circumcise your heart. And part of that is the action of going out and caring for the foreigner who is among you.